Reading some of the interviews that Mal has done promoting this fabulous book, my favourite was the anecdote he told that of his time after leaving 10 in 2013. He was hired for another year or so, basically a keep off the grass agreement, so 9 or 7 couldn't snap him up, which I'm sure they would have. He spent the year in a job as a mentor to Channel 10 journalists, and as Mal lamented in this interview, in the entire 12 months, only one young reporter came to see him. Her name was Georgia Love. Georgia, the younger people here know exactly who I'm talking about. She sat down, listened to Mal's advice, drew on his decades of experience, and promptly left journalism to become the Bachelorette. I think, and she has succeeded as well. Another one of Mal's success stories. Georgia is one of many people, yours truly included, who over the years have admired Mal's work on the screen. He, over the decades, has been the picture of professionalism, poise and clarity and sheer perseverance in an often tough media environment. 44 years in TV, 53 years in the media, and I encourage you to, if you haven't already, buy Mal's book. He'll be getting RSI, I'm sure, at the back of the room afterwards. There'll be books available for you to buy and for him to sign. It is a collection of diaries he kept over 53 years in journalism, which he assiduously wrote every day for 53 years. But it's also not so much just Mal's personal story, it is a fantastic history of TV news in this country, and in particular TV news in Melbourne. And what many people don't know is that, as well as being a terrific newsreader, Mal was a journalist. He started and spent the first bulk of his career as an on-the-road reporter, which held him in very good stead for becoming a TV newsreader for many years at Channel 7 and Channel 10. Please give it up for Mr. Mal Walden.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. This has been an absolute delight, having achieved a publication of the book. It's taken 53 years to write. I'm not the fastest hare in the paddock, but I got there in the end. Thanks to Mark Zocchi from Brolga and his wife, Julie, who nursed me gently through 12 months of editing. It's not a kiss and tell book, and it's not a bite the hand that's fed me type of book. In fact, I believe I've been quite self-deprecating. I always want to say self-defecating, but it's kind of the same word, and I've got a history of words like phenomenon, but it's a mix, a blend of media and memoir. And the memoir is not all about me. It's about the icons of the industry who have largely been forgotten over the years, who have not received the plaudits I believe were necessary for the achievements they contributed to the media industry. I mean, most of the media books I have read appear to have been written by Sydney-based authors about Sydney-based networks and the rise and fall of Sydney-based tycoons. This is unashamedly a Melbourne story to sort of balance the books. As Michael alluded to, the basis, the genesis of the book were diaries. Now, when I first started, I was 17 when I applied for my first job, and my mentor at the time was an iconic broadcaster in Melbourne by the name of Lee Murray, and he suggested that when I get down to 3YB in Warrnambool, I write down things because I'm going to be hit by an information overload. So I began to write things down in a journal, and it became a sort of a system that I adopted for the next 53 years. After every shift for 53 years, I would just sit down and write an observation of the day, a highlight of the day, and a reaction. And it was those memories, when I look back on them about 20 years ago, I realized that indeed they were telling a story not only of my life, but how the whole media industry had evolved. I look back on those and I see, and it stands out that the 70s was, I think, the most defining decade of television news. It started with satellites bringing in national and international news. We did the transition from black and white to color, and perhaps the most important transition of all was the transition from film to tape, where we started to package news stories, and so began the birth of that insidious 10-second soundbite, which is now sometimes reduced to nothing more than 1 or 2 seconds per story. The 70s also provided an insight, a personal insight for me. I started my career in television in 1970 at Channel 7. And I met one of the icons that I referred to, who has largely gone, he's not a household name, and there are many of you in here today that will remember him, of course, were mentored by him, and I'm speaking of John Marr. He was an eccentric character who would not have survived in this day of political correctness, but survive he did, and he mentored some of the greats. He mentored the first newsreader in Melbourne, Eric Pearce, and he mentored his successor, Jeff Raymond, and his successor, Brian Naylor, and myself, and David Johnson, and Dan Webb, and Pam Graham, who's here tonight, and Dermot O'Brien, who went on to become a news director in his own right. He was, I think, the driving force behind news and set the template for what television news is today. He also not only discovered the most number of high-profile newsreaders, he also, sadly, was, in his watch, lost the most number of staff. He lost, of course, 4 colleagues in that tragic helicopter crash in the early 80s, and that was by far the hardest news story I ever had to read, and was one of the most difficult news chapters in my book. And he was also, of course, there when the boys went to East Timor. And they left Melbourne, and a lot has been written about Balibo and the Balibo Five. A lot has been written, there's been a film made of it, but none from the perspective of the newsroom from which they left, nor the man who sent them there. And he regretted till the day he died the toss of a coin that determined who would go, the toss of a coin that led to Greg Shackleton, Gary Cunningham, and Tony Stewart to depart for East Timor. And I'm so thrilled to see Annie here tonight, the sister of Tony Stewart, because Annie, this is a tribute as well to the many people, the many journalists, the many colleagues who died simply doing their job, including Tony. In 1976, a little girl disappeared from the bedroom of a home down in Beaumaris, and I was sent down to interview the distraught mother. And as soon as I walked into that house, I formed a friendship with Patsy Wallage that continues to this day. And Patsy described her very close friend and confidant and comforter. And I remember thinking at the time that if I was going to turn this news story into a special, I needed to track down that special girlfriend. I didn't have to look very far, for several months later she became John Marr's personal secretary in the Channel 7 newsroom, the unit manager of the 7 News. Several years later, she became my wife. And today, Patsy Wallage is godmother to our daughter, Sarah. And it's lovely to have my wife with me, the corporate manager of Walden Inc., and my living, walking auto-prompt. And if you want to know a story of synchronicity, because I have woven all my stories through the highlights of news and through the highlights and the lowlights of television, the one story that, to me, stands out concerns. And everything has happened to me on June the 6th. I started my career on June the 6th in 1961. I went to Channel 7 in 1970, and I read my first news bulletin on June the 6th. I even retired on June the 6th officially, but that was not coincidence. I just didn't want to break the synchronicity. But the story of synchronicity is summed up by this 27-year-old signalman. And when I talk of June the 6th, we all remember it was D-Day in 1944. And this 27-year-old signalman landed on a beach codenamed Sword, part of the Allied invasion of Normandy. And he fought his way through to Berlin. He was a signalman, and he told me that he fancied himself as a news correspondent, a journalist, but for whatever he was sending to the headquarters would be disseminated and become the basis of public news. And he arrived in Berlin just before it capitulated, and in the center of Berlin was a young newsreel cameraman attached to Hitler's notorious SS. And he was a bit younger than the signalman, But he'd survived the Russian front, he'd survived the Polish front, and he was determined to survive the fall of Berlin, which he did. And he surrendered to the Americans and was handed over to the British. And he found himself working alongside the signalman in a displacement camp in a town called Blomberg. 50 years later, I found myself working alongside that former SS cameraman. He became the senior news cameraman at Channel 10 in Melbourne. His name is Maury Pillins. Many of you will know him. And during an interview with Maury Pillins for my memoir, I discovered the identity of that British signalman. He was indeed my father, the greatest mentor of the lot. So that is the synchronicity that is woven through my life and the industry of television. And that brings us to Channel 10. In 2010, I was called into management, and it was explained to me that they were going to launch a news revolution, with George Negus reading a news series at 6 o'clock. I was to do a news program at 6:30, and the 1 hour news would remain between 5 and 6, and the project would follow. It was a massive news project. $20 million had been invested in this. And we're kind of, thinking of synchronicity. I started my career with arguably the biggest and most successful network campaign called the 7 Revolution in 1970. So I thought, well, that's nice. I'll finish my career on a revolution. What we didn't know was that just a few months before we launched this revolution, James Packer launched his own revolution and became the senior shareholder of the 10 network. And he appointed Lachlan Murdoch as the person to run it. And so began a series of dramas that no Hollywood scriptwriter could have dreamt up in their wildest dreams. And because I'd chronicled daily the events of the industry, it would have been remiss of me not to sit there and chronicle every day during that, what I have termed the perfect storm that hit Channel 10. Now, I know Channel 10 are not particularly, well, some of the executives in Sydney are not particularly happy with my book, but I just want to make one thing clear. I believe Channel 10 is the most resilient network of the lot. They've been through tough times before, and they've always recovered. And they are now, and no one is happier than me to see them making that recovery. And I'm very happy to see so many of my colleagues from Channel 10 here today. We've been through a lot. The perfect storm, I can always remember someone once said to me, a newsreader once said to me, in a storm, an anchor is the first thing that's tossed overboard. Well, believe me, we tossed a few overboard during the perfect storm that hit Channel 10. But as I say, it is recovering, it is resilient. And the reason it's resilient, I was always told, a psychologist once told me that the third-born child is the one that has to push the boundaries to make a point of difference. And Channel 10 was the third-born network, and it has pushed the boundaries, and it's taken chances, and some of those chances have paid off, and some of them haven't. So what I'm saying is, I'm not biting the hand that's fed me, and no one is happy that Channel 10 is recovering. It's been a fabulous journey. I couldn't have done it without so many of you here today. I couldn't have done it without Mark and Julie. Someone once said a newsreader should have black for a look of authority, glasses for a look of maturity, and hemorrhoids for a look of concern. And I kind of feel that if there's any concern, it's for the doomsayers who are predicting the death of news in all its traditional forms. Because I looked at the figures the other day, and 86.1% of people, of Australians, are still watching free-to-air television. And the most successful, the most watched program on all networks is the nightly news. So I think it's got a pulse. I think it's got a future. I don't know quite in what form that future is, but I have great, great hopes for television news. Finally, I've dedicated my book to my wife, Pauline, and my kids, Sarah and James, for they inherited a very public spotlight, but they forever kept me grounded in its luminous flux. And believe me, for those of you who know, television, since the day it began 60 years ago on Sunday week here in Melbourne, has been in a constant state of flux. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much.
So does that mean, as a retired newsreader, the hemorrhoids have gone now?
Well, I'm standing up.
Can I
sit down?
pick that? Yes, please sit down. We'd love to invite questions from the floor, but can I also acknowledge one of the other giants of Melbourne TV news has just arrived, Peter Hitchener. Hitch, great to see you. Thanks for coming. So please, we have a roving mic. Mic's somewhere around the room. Just here with David. Please raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Just after mentioning Hitch, I want to ask you, Mal, who's your favourite Melbourne newsreader?
Peter Hitchner. Actually, you're the guy I do watch every night. And Channel 7.
Another former newsreader with a fantastic voice, Mr. Colin Tyrus. Hello.
Hello, Mel. Were there any words that you hated to have to confront while reading the news? Any words you really shied away from pronouncing? For example, I used to hate saying the suburb Lilydale. Are there any of yours that you can recall?
Yes, I have, apart from phenomenon. Rural breweries. Whenever I saw rural breweries written in a script, I'd just call it a country pub. There were quite a few words like that. I used to change them quite regularly.
Yes, Eileen.
Mal, thank you for coming today, and I'm sure we'll all leave here with a book. Now, you talk about, you're very generous about all your colleagues and mentors that you've had. Can you just define one mentor and what that mentor gave you for the rest of your working life?
Oh, that's a good one, because it stands out. I love easy questions. Questions that I have an answer for. Yeah, there is one man who stands out in my mind, and that's David Johnson. Now, I know there were some key people prior to him, and Eric Pearce and Jeff Raymond and Brian Naylor, but David Johnson stood out for a number of reasons. He reached the pinnacle in his career as an on-the-road reporter. He reached the pinnacle of his career as a television newsreader. He became a network director of news, and he became a shareholder of the company. In every stage of his life, he reached the top in his profession. DJ, we knew each other as school kids. We both migrated from Britain. We both finished up in the Western District. He went to Terang High. I went to Warrnambool High. For a brief spell, we discovered that we actually played baseball against each other. We had a passion for radio. We both joined 3DB in the 60s. We both joined Channel 7 in the 70s. We both joined Channel 10 in the 80s. But the thing that stands out, it was DJ who picked me up after I was sacked during that Fairfax takeover of Channel 7 in 1987. He offered me a job, he picked me up. He was my life raft. So, good friend, yeah, DJ.
Mal,
Tim.
hi. Let me take you back to Christmas Day 1974. I haven't had the pleasure of reading the book yet, but as I can remember, one of the big stories that you covered in your history as a reporter was Cyclone Tracy. And thanks to the Learjet we hired, I think you were one of the first on the ground there. What are your memories of that particular incident?
Well, very clear. I was not getting on with the volatile news director, John Marr. I say you learn by your mistakes, and I think I learned more than anyone else because I must have been making more mistakes than most other people. And I was given my final warning. And on Christmas Day 1974, we knew a cyclone had hit Darwin, but we had no idea of the damage that it had caused. And I was due to knock off at 12 o'clock. And in walked John Marr at 3 minutes to 12. And his first words that he snapped at the Chief of Staff is, "What are we doing about Darwin?" And the Chief of Staff, "Was that you?" You replied, "Brisbane are looking at it." And he snapped, if I remember rightly, "Brisbane are just dingbats. You're supposed to be news people." And he stormed off into his office, came back in 5 minutes' time and said, "I've hired a Learjet." That in itself was pretty remarkable because in those days, to even buy a tram ticket, you had to sign in triplicate. And he went out and hired a bloody Learjet. And then he said, "Now, who have we got to send?" Now, Nails was on holiday. DJ was reading the news. Pam Graham was out on assignment. Everyone was, and the chief, you must have said, "Well, we've got Walden." And I just heard him say, "Shit, isn't there anyone else?" And he walked over to me and he said, "Mal," he said, "I'm sending you to Darwin. This will either make you or break you, son. Don't let me down." So with the fear of him, I went up. And I said things I would never normally have said, did things I never normally would have done. but we got the story, and it flew out on that Learjet within an hour and a half of us touching down. And that's why it was the first story. They opened up the satellites at 6:25. The news was on at 6:30, and they were the first pictures, apparently, I was not aware of this, the first pictures that went around the world of Cyclone Tracy. I went up as a cadet and came back as a journalist. So it was a groundbreaking story for a young cadet who was on the skids, and I never looked back from that moment.
Mr. Walden, Bevan Levison for Might Hat. What is your opinion of personal opinion in a newsreader?
Personal opinion of a newsreader?
Yes. Expressing personal opinion as a newsreader.
What I think makes a good newsreader? I think compassion, credibility, and a skill of communication. To me, they're the attributes you look for in a good newsreader. However, having said that, I have seen some of the most technically appalling newsreaders become the most successful newsreaders. So it's an indefinable X factor that determines, it's very, very subjective. You can be the best, you can be the worst, but if you've got a power base and you're popular, it doesn't really matter. And the longer you do it, the better chances you have of surviving. Is that about right, Pete?
Who were the technically appalling ones?
That's a bit like asking me who I think are the best female newsreaders I've read with. You know, there ain't no answer to that one that I'm going to give.
Yeah, please raise your hand for questions. Are there times, Mal, when you're sitting at home watching Hitch or Mitch on Channel 7 that you miss it and you really want to get back into the studio?
Look, I think I missed it right at the beginning, and I remember every time I went to the fridge at about 5 o'clock and opened the fridge door and the light came on, I wanted to say something. It was a sort of, I don't miss it now, not one bit. Newsreading, I don't know whether Hitch realizes this, but you go on holiday for a month and you come back, and it's quite a nerve-wracking experience getting back into the chair again. Once you're back, it's fine. But I've been away for 3 years, so I don't really want to get back in the chair again.
I'll come to you in a sec, Hitch, but Jim. Yep.
Thank you. Jim Clark.
Yep.
Over your many years, there must have been many unexpected difficulties, audio problems and other problems, or people not being there when they're supposed to be there. What really was the worst experience you had on air?
There were many embarrassing moments, most of which you unfortunately didn't see on the video. That in itself was an embarrassing moment. But I suppose the one moment that sometimes I do regret was one night in the news when a story went to air about a certain airline hostess. And she had had a mile-high fling with the actor Ralph Fiennes, and most of the industry had covered that. But about 6 weeks later, we ran a story about her promoting a range of lingerie. And we discussed this at great length. I'm not looking at anybody. We discussed this at great length, and it was determined that the shorter version would run. But the wrong version happened to go to air that night, and I think the producers could see my frustration, and it was cut. Now, the next line after that was a promotion for what was coming up in the news, and it read something like, "Is homework a waste of time?" coming up. But I added the words, "Is homework, like that airline hostess story, a waste of time?" And I heard the gasp go up on the floor, and I thought, ooh, maybe I overstepped the line. Boy, did I overstep the line. I received the severest bollocking from the manager. And in hindsight, I tried to justify my decision, but in hindsight, he was quite right. I overstepped the line. And I used, in his words, I used the network to criticize a colleague, or more than one colleague. And that was unforgivable. And I look back on that, that was a bit of a regret. I did overstep the line. And I'm not quite sure why I did. I felt that I'd overstepped the line many times with some of my quips, but that was the one that got me into trouble.
Mal, I'm just wondering, why is it that you actually did stop? Because I remember begging you every time I saw you in the lead up to your, your retirement, don't do it.
Yeah. It's quite easy. I can answer that one. It was the state of the company, the state of the network. Yeah. It was deplorable, to use a Clinton expression. And it was very, very sad. And it was sad to watch the mass retrenchments that were going on. I mean, it wasn't just one, it was about 4. And all the experience had gone, and the trainees that were in the staff were becoming the trainers, the juniors were becoming the seniors. It was just a very sad moment, and I didn't want to hang around under that cloud. I'd seen it all before, I think, and besides, another thing, Hitch, I lied about my age. All through my career, I lied about my age. That's all wrong. I was born in 1943. What happened was when Ron Casey appointed me as the newsreader when Nails came across to you guys, he appointed me as, and he wanted to promote me to give me credibility. He said, he's a news reporter, so he'll know what he's talking about. It was purely just for promotion. And he said, besides, you look too young, so we'll get the publicity to put up your age. And he said, I don't like your hair, it's too red, so they coloured it every night. Many years later, when I was at Channel 10, and I was reaching my 60s, they said, you're too old. We put your age back. And only one person ever picked it up. It was Robert Fidgen. And he quoted, some people use Botox to make themselves appear younger. Walden uses Biogs. So, it's all marketing. Television is all perception.
Mal, you've been made redundant. You've seen networks go into receivership. You've lost colleagues. Describe your worst day. What is the worst day in your career?
Oh, there's no question. The day the helicopter crashed. To be told that 4 of your closest colleagues, and we were a very close-knit little team, and so we were not just colleagues, we were friends. So that was the hardest. The only time in my career that we recorded the news up to the first commercial break, and that took, I think, 5 attempts, and we got the first down about 25 past 6, so we just barely made it in time, because I don't know whether I could have made it. I walked in that afternoon, and Colin Patterson was the acting news boss at that time, on that day, and he just came to me and he said, sorry mate, it's Blake, and he went through the names, and he said, you're going to have to read it, so I'm going to make you write it, because that's the only way you're going to get through it. So he gave me a typewriter, locked me in a room, and that's how I got through it.
Yeah, it would have been a very tough day. Just on the other side of that spectrum, are there stories that you liked presenting? Any particular genre of stories that you saw in the rundown and you thought, this will make my day?
Yeah, I think the most satisfying period was a segment I used to do when I first came over from Channel 7. I just remember the enormous public backlash when I was sacked from Channel 7, which reduced the 7 News to virtually an asterisk. And we went across to Channel 10 and we got a 40% share, which was about 1 million viewers a night. I mean, that was unheard of. And to capitalise on the intercity rivalry, because 7 was perceived to have been, their news was coming out of Sydney, which it wasn't. But to capitalise on this intercity rivalry and the fact that we were a Melbourne station at Channel 10, they gave me a segment called Mal's Melbourne. And that was perhaps the most satisfying on-camera, on-road experience, doing these little stories of unsung heroes and the colour pieces that wouldn't normally have made news. They made news. And the power of having an audience of that size and the people writing in to get their own stories across was just phenomenal. See, I can say it now. It was just a wonderful experience. Pammy.
There's a microphone coming.
Sorry. First female journalist, first female reporter on the 7 network.
Thanks, Mal. What's next? I know you've got grandfather duties. You can't play golf every day. Is there another book in the wings, or
Well,
am I...
Well,
What's happening?
I'm being looked at. I have been busy in the last 12, well, since I left television. I've written 2 children's books, which I've self-published, and that's for my grandson, my 8-month-old grandson. He won't understand it until he's about 5 or 6. And I've finished my memoir, and I've been commissioned to write 2 more books, strangely enough, on Mal's Melbourne. So we're still in the talking process at this stage, aren't we?
We don't know when we see those.
Well, one next year and one the year after. I think that's the plan. I'm halfway through the first.
Congratulations.
Yes, please. Ashley. Yeah.
Hello, Ashley Gillen from Sky News.
Ashley.
Nice to see you now. Hello. I'm wondering about your view on the new breed of journalists, young journalists. Are you excited? You said you were excited about the future of television news, but I'm wondering, are you excited about the speed at which journalists are having to work at, and whether or not you may be concerned at the Twitter version of journalists these days, and journalists filming their own piece to cameras and filing their own live crosses? Are you excited about that or worried?
Read the final chapter in my book, the epilogue. That sums up my feelings entirely.
Give us a snapshot.
I'll give
us
you,
the upshot.
give you a snapshot. I'm excited about the youth. I'm depressed at the lack of experience that has been lost. So that kind of balances that out. I'm excited about the number of platforms in which news can be sourced now. I think there's more news out there now than there's ever been before. That is the upside. The rush to be first, to get that news to where worries the shit out of me, because there are no checks or balances in that race to be first. I'm excited about, you know, I looked at you, and you're a stunning looking lady, and I don't say that in any sexist way at all. It's just that there are very few young guys coming up through the ranks. There are a lot of women, and it worries me a little bit, because women have it tough in television, and their greatest critics are women viewers. But the thing is that now, more than ever, there are more elegant, eloquent, intelligent women, young women, coming up through the ranks. It's just going to make it that much more competitive for you guys. So I worry a little bit about that. But I don't know whether I've answered your question, but that's my little snapshot of various aspects of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, please raise your hand. While I wait for the next question, Mal, you've worked with a number of fantastic female co-presenters over the years. Invariably, tensions arise. Who reads what story? Who does what political cross? How are they resolved? Or did the United Nations, in the form of the news director, have to come in to work it out?
We never had problems like that. I must say, our biggest problem at the desk were the stories that we ran, and when there was a female, my co-reader, myself, and Quarters sitting at the desk, the arguments we would have politically, screaming matches at the desk, and I was like the moderator between, Miss Left and Mr. Right. That was the biggest problem. Just making sure that the floor manager would be screaming 10 seconds, 10 seconds, and this incredible argument would be raging at the desk, not over who would read what, the politics of the actual story. I found that more nerve-wracking than anything. Yeah.
And then the red light goes on and it's happy
Then the
smiling.
red light goes and everyone's smiling and no one would know the difference.
Until the outbreak.
Be kind.
Oh yeah, of course I would. No, I guess I don't know how many people here would know that you were destined to be in the spotlight, because I remember you telling me a story from when you were little, from a movie many, many moons ago, and you were on a bike, and we probably still see you in that on the beach.
Oh, that was in Frankston, 1956 or 7. They were filming on the beach, and I was riding my bike. I had a part-time after-school job pumping petrol in a service station. I was on my way down to Beaurepairs to do my Sunday morning shift, and the road was blocked. And the policeman standing there, and he said, where are you heading? I said, across the road to bow repairs. And he said, well, when I wave my hand, you can ride your bike. And I looked across to the other side of the road, there were all the cameras, and it was the crew from On the Beach, and they were filming a street scene, and they cued me, and I rode my bike all the way down and into bow repairs. Now, I think I must have finished up on the editing floor, because I don't ever see it. But yeah, that was my, if that's the story you're referring to, yeah.
Well said. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause to Mal Walden.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much indeed.